In this video, I'm going to try to take the given matrix and put it in row echelon form. So this video is going to take it just to row echelon form, and then the next video will take it from the row echelon form to the reduced echelon form. Since this is a large matrix, I wanted to break that into parts. All right, so we always start by trying to get a 1 in that top left corner. Right now it's a 2. So one option is that would turn this 2 into a 1 would be to multiply the entire row by 1/2. That's one way that we get 1s. Change entries to 1 is just multiply the whole row by the reciprocal. That's not ideal if that's going to result in fractions as some of your entries, because fractions tend to expand. Once they appear in the matrix, they tend to expand all over as you row reduce. So if we can find another way, then that would be good. And notice we've got the -1 here. If we do, I'm trying to think of where I can fit this. If we do row 2 plus row 1 and make that the new row 1, that would result in a 1 in this entry. So I'm going to use that row operation since the values stay a little simpler. Okay, so that's the new row 1. So as I work through here, -1 plus 2, so that's 1, just like we wanted. 1 plus 1 here, so that's 2. 0 plus 3. 1 plus 2 is 3. And 0 plus 4 is 4. And then we should continue over here, so the 1 plus 12 is 13. Okay, and I'm going to leave the other rows the way they were. Although in the next step, I might attack row 2 and row 3 here in one step. Okay, so we've got a 1 in the top left corner. The next target would be to get a 0, zeros below it. So to turn this entry into a 0 and turn this entry into a 0. And that was what I was saying I might attempt to do in one step here. So first to turn this into a 0. Again, we could just add row 1 plus row 2 now, but replace row 2. That'll turn this into a 0. So the way I'd write that row operation is, well, just what I said. So row 1 plus row 2, this is a plus, row 2, and make that the new row 2. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So leave row 1 the way it was. But now I'm going to do the row operation and change row 2. So 1 plus -1, so that's 0. 2 plus 1, so that's 3. 3 plus 0, so that's 3. 3 plus 1, and 4 plus 0, and 13 plus 1. Okay. Now, rather than copy row 3 the way it is, I'm also going to go ahead and try to change this into a 0. So to do that, I would like to add -3. We usually work from the pivot term in that column. So the pivot in row 1, I'm going to do -3 times row 1 plus row 3. -3 times row 1 and add that to row 3 and make that the new row 3. Okay, so talking that through, -3 times this would be -3 plus 3. Is 0. -3 times this would be -6 plus -1 is -7. -3 times this would be -9 plus 2 is -7 again. -3 times this is -9 plus 2, -7 again. Interesting. -3 times this is -12 plus 5, -7 again. And -3 times this is -39. -39 plus 11, so -28. Okay. Our next target, now we've got the first column the way we want it. We'd now like to have a 1 really in this position. To get a 1 here, it looks like I'm going to need to multiply the row by 1/3, which I don't really want to do because, like I said, we're going to get some fractions here. We'd like to avoid that. It would be much easier to make a 1 here because I could multiply by the reciprocal -1/7, and all of these would be integers. So I'm going to go after it this way. I'm going to do 2 steps. Let me go ahead and just scale this. We might as well. Everything's a multiple of -7. So we might as well scale that row by multiplying by the reciprocal. -1/7 times row 3, and make that the new row 3. So I'll need a new page to write that out. Okay, so I'll do this as quickly as I can. I'm going to have to copy the other rows the way they were. Okay, and then once we do -1/7 times all of row 3, these were all -7ths, so they're all going to turn into 1s. And then we had a -28 over here, so times -1/7 will be +4. Okay. We can now do a swap. Swap row 2 and row 3. That way we have a 1 in that next diagonal position. Okay, and so just copy down that row 2 now in row 3. All right, the next target is to turn this into a 0. In the row echelon form, we need zeros below each pivot. So to turn this into a 0, we would do -3 times row 2 and add that to row 3. Make that the new row 3. All right, so I paused the video while I copied down those first 2 rows. Now it's row 3 that's going to change. So let's talk through that. -3 times 0 plus 0, so that's still 0. -3 times 1, so that's -3 plus 3, that's 0. And the same thing's going to happen here. -3 plus this is 0. So those next 2 entries are both zeros. And then -3 times 1, so -3 plus 4 would be 1. Same deal here. And then -3 times this would be -12 plus 14, so that's +2. And I'm just keeping an eye on all of this to make sure. Okay. We now have the row echelon form of the matrix. I will post a second video that gives the reduction further to the reduced row echelon form.